I'm a lawyer. I love the applause from the dog. That's always reassuring. So as I say, I spent a year in America. This was during Watergate. Very exciting time for a young lawyer to be in America. The whole legal system was under siege. Then I went back to New Zealand and I got married. I got mortgaged. I joined Rotary and I joined a law firm, and I was there for 18 years. And then one day I had a call from the World Bank in Washington, would I consider moving to America? And I thought about that for half a second and said yes. And a few months later, my wife and I and our 2 children moved back to America. That was in 1992. 10 years later, my daughter graduated from UVA, and 5 years later, my son graduated from UVA. And you can imagine my pride as I watched first my daughter, then my son, process down the lawn of Mr. Jefferson's University as I had done 30 years previously. So it's quite a nice Rotary story. I retired from the bank in 2009, and I've basically been full-time in Rotary ever since. I've had lots of great assignments. I chaired the Alumni Committee. I chaired the Rotary Peace Centers Committee for 3 years. That's the committee that oversees the Rotary Peace Fellowship, selects the scholars. I served for 2 years as the Dean of the Rotary Representative Network, which I'm sure you've never heard of, and I'll explain a little bit more about that in my remarks. And then I joined the board on the 1st of July last year. So I'm about just over a quarter of a way through my 2-year term. And I represent zones 33 and 34, which extends from the north of Pennsylvania, Erie, Pennsylvania, all the way down the East Coast, all of the Caribbean except for the Dominican Republic, and 3 countries in South America. So it's quite a long territory with about 70,000 Rotarians, 1,800 Rotary clubs, much the same as all the other directors. So that's really who I am. I've had a particular focus in Rotary on peace building. So I just welcome any opportunity I get to talk about Rotary's role as a peace building organization. And we have a very rich and I think interesting history. So let me get straight into it. As we all know, Rotary started in 1905 in your part of the world. Started slowly, 1910, there were only 16 clubs. The focus at that time, of course, was on service. But the overriding international issue at the time was the possibility that war might break out in Europe. The forces of nationalism were getting stronger and stronger. And sure enough, in 1914, Germany and England declared war on each other. It was a terrible war, a lot of destruction, a lot of death, a lot of injury. After the war, the focus on Rotary became very much what can Rotarians do to prevent that terrible event from ever happening again. In 1921, Rotarians met in Edinburgh at the International Convention and passed a resolution calling, amongst other things, for Rotarians to promote international understanding, goodwill, and peace. And those words, international understanding, goodwill, and peace, have since become enshrined in our official object. This year, we celebrate the centenary of those words. And of course, they are the foundation of the Rotary Foundation itself. Rotary continued to grow very rapidly in the 20s and 30s. Let me just quote some figures. In 1918, we had 400 Rotary clubs. 3 years later, we celebrated club number 1,000, the Rotary Club of York in England. 4 years later, we got to 2,000 clubs. Rotary Club of Ketchikan in Alaska was club number 2,000. In 1936, we got to 4,000 clubs, Hanover, Pennsylvania. And 3 years later, in 1939, we hit 5,000 clubs. Rockmart, Georgia was club number 5,000. So at that time, we had approximately 150,000 Rotarians all around the world. Rotary was a vast organization and very influential. In those days, the classification system was applied rather more stringently than is currently the case. To be a member of Rotary, of course, you had to be male, but leaving aside that, you had to be a respected member of your vocation or your profession, a partner or a manager or a school principal or a sheriff. So when the Rotary clubs met for their annual district conference, this was truly a meeting of local community movers and shakers. And when we met internationally, this was a very significant meeting. Prior to the Second World War, there was no such thing as a non-governmental organization, an NGO. Now there are thousands of NGOs, but Rotary was really the first NGO. And we passed resolutions which are very significant from an international perspective. For example, in 1940, the Rotary International Convention was held in Havana, Cuba. I might just add that at that time, there were 58 Rotary clubs in Cuba. Today, there are none, although we do hope that that will change before too long. So at that conference, Rotarians passed a resolution calling, amongst other things, for respect for human rights. That was the first time those words, respect for human rights, had entered into the international vocabulary. And that became the basis for the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights, signed in 1948, arguably one of the most significant documents signed in the last century. 2 years later, in 1942, in the middle of the Second World War, a number of Rotarians met in London. They were concerned about the impact of the war on education, scientific research, cultural norms and traditions. They passed a resolution which led a few years later to the formation of UNESCO, the United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization. 2 years later, in 1944, after President Truman and Prime Minister Churchill decided that the time had come to establish an organization that would prohibit war for all time, Rotary was one of a very small number of organizations invited to send lawyers and other experts to work alongside officials from China, the former Soviet Union, the United States, and the United Kingdom to begin the process of drafting what would become the United Nations Charter. And when the charter was signed in San Francisco in June of 1945, 49 out of the 800 delegates were Rotarians. In 1946, the United Nations decided to establish an internship program. The idea was to bring young people from all around the world to New York to observe the workings of this new organization. Great idea, but no money. What did they do? They approached Rotary, and Rotary made a grant of $18,000 to fund the first United Nations internship program. In the 50s, 60s, and 70s, Rotary's relationship with the United Nations really went into abeyance. This was the time of the Cold War, but we reconnected with the United Nations in 1985 when we established the Global Polio Eradication Initiative. We partnered with UNICEF, with the World Health Organization, with CDC, the Center for Diseases Control, and then subsequently with the Gates Foundation, Gavi, the Global Alliance for Vaccines, and others. And that has since become a very important relationship for Rotary. The eradication of polio, as you all know, is Rotary's #1 external priority. In the late 1980s, an increasing number of Rotarians were reaching out to UN agencies and international organizations. So in 1990, the board decided to establish the Rotary Representative Network. This is the body that I mentioned in my introduction. There are 16 entities in the network, and they include some of the primary organs of the UN, UNESCO, UNICEF, United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, the UN Environment Programme, UN Commission on Women, WHO, FAO, the Food and Agricultural Organization. And Rotary has appointed Rotarian ambassadors with a small a as our representatives in the cities in which those organizations are based. So we have 2 in Rome, 2 in Paris at UNESCO headquarters, 2 in Brussels at the European Union, 2 in London at the Commonwealth of Nations, 3 in Geneva, where the European headquarters of the United Nations is based, 6 in New York, 4 in Washington, DC, and others spread around the world, in Manila, in Abidjan, in Cairo, in Addis Ababa. In the early 1990s, we started the practice of having a Rotary Day at the United Nations. And there was a time when the Rotary Day at the UN was the 3rd most significant event on the international calendar, after the International Convention and the International Assembly. Typically, the board would meet in New York, either just before or just after the Rotary Day. 3 years ago, for the first time, we held a Rotary Day at the UN in Geneva at the European headquarters. 2 years ago, we met in Nairobi, the African headquarters of the United Nations. I had the good fortune to be part of the planning committee for that event, and I went down to Nairobi, and that's when I discovered that the UN Environment Programme is headquartered in Nairobi. So while I was there, I asked to meet with representatives of the UN Environment. 5 young people came into the room, all very environmental activist-looking people. Unbeknown to us, the team leader was a Rotary Peace Fellow from New Zealand. Doesn't get much better than that. The second person was a former Rotary ambassadorial scholar. The third person was the president of one of the local clubs. And they came with a list of 25 environmental projects which they thought might be of interest to clubs and districts around the Rotary world. That led to a meeting between then President Barry Rassin and the Chief Executive of UN Environment, which led to a meeting between John Hugo, the Chief Executive of Rotary, and senior officials of UN Environment. And that led to a decision to establish a task force to prepare an environmental toolkit. The idea was to come up with a practical document which clubs could use to identify environmental projects, to evaluate, to implement, to monitor. This was a collaboration between UN Environment, the staff in Evanston, and Rotary's Environmental Sustainable Rotary Action Group. A very successful document. It was distributed in Hamburg 2 years ago at the International Convention. You can download it from the Rotary website. I now see that Mark has put on his virtual environmental background, so I'm sure that he is well aware of this document, but if he isn't, if the rest of you aren't, you should get a copy. It's a very professional publication. And we are hopeful of coming up with similar toolkits for each of the other areas of focus. A few hours ago, I was on a call with the World Health Organization in Geneva. President Holger was a spokesperson, along with President Tedros, Dr. Tedros, who's the chief executive. And we are working with WHO and the action groups in the health sector to come up with a toolkit for maternal and child health care, and indeed for the other areas of focus. Last year, the UN celebrated the 75th anniversary of the signing of the Charter. So Mark Maloney, last year's president, decided to hold a series of presidential conferences around the world to celebrate the 75th anniversary of the relationship between Rotary and the UN. The first was held in New York in November of 2019. The second was scheduled to be held last January in Santiago, Chile. Sadly, that had to be cancelled because of protests in Chile at the time. The third was due to be held in Paris in February at UNESCO, the fourth in Rome in May at FAO, and the final one was to be held in Honolulu at the convention last year. And sadly, the last three conferences had to be cancelled because of the pandemic. It's a great shame because the one in Honolulu was to be held on June the 5th, which happens to be World Environment Day. Mark, I hope you knew that. June the 5th is World Environment Day. And we had arranged for a number of high-level UN speakers to address the Rotary Convention. This year, we've had two Rotary Days. One was held last November in Brussels in association with World Polio Day. And that was an opportunity for Rotary to pay a tribute to the member states of the European Union that have contributed to the polio eradication initiative. The second was due to be held this month, also in WHO, in person, but that has been postponed until next year. And there are other Rotary Days at the UN planned in future years. We've also had Rotary Days at the World Bank, at the White House, at the Organization for American States. It has become quite a popular way for Rotarians in cities around the world to celebrate the relationship between Rotary and key international organizations. Leaving aside the Rotary Representative Network, and I should just say that I had the honor of serving as the Dean of the Rotary Representative Network for 2 years, a dream assignment in Rotary as far as I'm concerned, and I was sorry that I had to give it up to join the board. But moving on from Rotary's relationship with the United Nations, I think the next step in Rotary's peace-building journey was the decision in the late 1990s to establish the Rotary Peace Centers program. And I'm sure you're fairly familiar with that. We partnered with 6 universities around the world, each of which had a world-renowned reputation for its peace and conflict curriculum. The Peace Centers are in Bradford in England, in Tokyo, Japan, in Brisbane, Australia, in Uppsala in Sweden, and of course at Duke UNC in Chapel Hill. We also have 2 centers for the professional development program. One is based in Bangkok and the other opens this month at the University of Makerere in Kampala, Uganda. And we're very excited about that. I might also just tell you that last week at the trustees meeting, we received a gift which in total will come to around $15 million to fund the establishment of a Rotary Peace Center in the Middle East. So that's a very exciting development, and you'll be hearing more about that as it moves along. The Peace Center program, we now have around 1,400 graduates. These are the creme de la creme. I chaired this committee for 3 years. I had a lot to do with it. Very impressive. One of the criteria for application is that you have to have spent at least 3 years after your college degree in some peace-related environment. So this is not a scholarship for people who haven't quite decided what to do in life. So let's go back to university and put off the evil day for another year or two. This is for people who have definitely committed to a peace-building career. The average age for the master's program is 30. The average age for the certificate program is 40. It's a very generous fellowship. It's fully funded by the Peace Endowment Fund. It's at no cost to clubs or districts. You're familiar with this because you're just next door to Evanston, so I'm sure you've heard Peace Fellows. If you haven't, you should get a Peace Fellow on your speakers list because they are very impressive. And many of them now are in positions of some responsibility. at the United Nations, in the State Department, at the World Bank. So we're really beginning to get a dividend on our investment in this program. In 2010, we adopted Future Vision, a new blueprint for the Rotary Foundation, and that's when we developed the 6 areas of focus. Of course, we now have 7. Peace and conflict is one of them, and we have a number of projects around the world that focus on different aspects of peace and conflict resolution. We also established the Rotary Action Group for Peace in 2014, and that has become a very strong advocate amongst Rotarians who have a particular interest in peace building issues. We have partnered with a number of peace-oriented organizations, including the Institute for Economics and Peace, which was founded by Steve Killelea, an Australian, often described as the Bill Gates of Australia, a very wealthy man who decided to use his resources to fund research into the economic cost of war and peace. And he and his team developed the Global Peace Index, which measures the annual peaceability of nations around the world. And it is now used as a very significant research tool in universities and foundations. We've also partnered with Mediators Beyond Borders, very strongly involved in mediation. We've partnered with the US Peace Corps, and many Rotary Peace Fellows have served as Rotary Peace Corps volunteers. We have peace conferences all over the world all the time. Every 3 years, in conjunction with the Rotary Convention, we have a Rotary Peace Symposium. Rotary brings a number of peace fellows to the convention to promote awareness of the program. And this is really quite an extraordinary event. We've had 70 or 80 peace fellows. And when you see this group in a room, the energy, the excitement, the exchange of ideas, it's electrifying. Many Rotarians ask, what can I, as an individual Rotarian, do to promote peace? Well, you can now go online and do a 3-hour course, courtesy of the Institute for Economics and Peace, and you will become a certified peace builder. And there are all sorts of suggestions on that program of practical things that you and your club can do in the peace building arena. We have a peace academy, we have peace workshops, we have peace, you name it, we have peace activities. I'm often asked, after polio, what do you think is the likely corporate project, if we have one? And of course, the prescribed answer from Evanson is, keep your eye on polio. Let's not worry about the future beyond polio until we've eradicated polio. But if I was a betting man, I would like to think that the next project would have a peace dimension and possibly a peace and education dimension. There are many projects around the Rotary world which are combining peace and education. And I'm in the process of rolling out my own significant initiative in zones 33 and 34. It's called Youth and Peace in Action, engaging 100,000 young community peace builders. And I have about 20 out of the 31 districts in the 2 zones have signed on. We've raised quite a lot of money. We are in the process of raising a lot more money. And we'll be working with Interact clubs all across the 2 zones, of which there are many, and introducing a whole range of community-based peace-building projects, building on work that's been done in Texas and California and other parts of America. The initiative is being led by 2 Rotary Peace Fellows. And the 2 organizations they represent, one is Outward Bound, which is my other great passion in life. I did an Outward Bound course when I was 20 in New Zealand, and I went on, became involved in the administration, became the chairman of Outward Bound International. And the other implementing organization is New Gen Peace Builders, which has had a lot of experience in youth and peace education programs. So I'm excited about this initiative. And there are other youth and peace initiatives in many parts of the world, in the UK in particular. So there are many peace-related activities in the Rotary world. I like to say that peace building is in our DNA. I don't see us becoming a water and sanitation organization. That's an important area of focus. But there are many other organizations around the world that focus specifically on water and sanitation and hygiene. I don't see us becoming a maternal and child health organization. I think the World Health Organization has got that pretty well covered. Neither do I see us becoming a literacy or disease prevention. These are very important areas of focus for Rotary, and I don't undermine them in any way. But in the area of peace, I really do think Rotary has the ability to carve out a niche for ourselves, value. I strongly believe that Rotary and Rotarians have not only the ability, but have a responsibility to do what we can to help bridge some of the partisan divides that we have both in this part of the world and other parts of the world. Conflict always arises locally. So solutions to conflicts need to be developed at a local level. And what better organization to engage in peace solutions than Rotary, the world's largest community-based, peace-oriented organization. So on that note, President Joe, let me stop. I'm happy to answer any questions. I hope I've persuaded you that peace is in Rotary's DNA, and we're doing a lot to implement that noble goal. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Peter. Wow. I would say for a 20-year Rotarian, in half an hour, you just gave me more information on the peace building aspect of Rotary than 20 years combined. And I don't say that in a way that is a detriment to the education per se of the club members or of the Rotarians in general, but peace building seems to be, it's not one that clubs are very involved in hands-on necessarily. And that was amazing to hear your background in it and how passionate you are about the future with peace building. On that note, I would hope that there'd be a number of questions for Peter here. So anyone want to ask Peter any questions?
I think perhaps I've overwhelmed.
I'll start out with just a very simple one. You mentioned the 3-hour course to be certified as a peace builder. What was that organization again?
The Institute for Economics and Peace, IEP. Linda, after the call, I'll send you the link.
Joe, I have a question.
Sure.
Mr. Kyle, great presentation.
Thank you.
In my early years, I had the privilege of growing up in the Southeast Asian region, specifically Singapore, under the great leadership of former Lee Kuan Yew. My question is, having lived now in the West for more than 3 decades, very few people in this part of the world talk about the role of ASEAN. And ASEAN, I feel, having seen it firsthand in my first 20 years, and then understanding how it's evolved in partnership directly and indirectly with key world leaders over time. I mean, Lee Kuan Yew was in touch with US presidents, European leaders. He essentially guided them about Asian foreign policy. And given the instability of Asia after somewhat during the Cold War and after, now we talk about US-China tensions. I'm just curious, obviously, you've enlightened us with the great work Rotary is doing on peace building. Do we have a relationship with ASEAN? What are your thoughts on that subject?
Well, good question. No, we do not have a direct relationship with ASEAN. I also spent 5 years in the Philippines at the Asian Development Bank, so I'm fairly familiar with issues in Asia. I spent a lot of time commuting through Singapore. Asian Development Bank is our Asian link to the network, and that's based in Manila. But you're right, ASEAN has become an increasingly active and valued international member of the world order. There's a limit to the number of organizations that Rotary can link up with. We have 32 representatives and we have 16 entities. So I don't think there are any plans at the moment to expand the network beyond those organizations. Well, perhaps that's all I should say about that, but thank you for the question.